The weight of her words didn't lift with time. In fact, as the hours passed, it seemed to settle deeper into the fabric of political conversation across the nation. Social media erupted. Hashtags with Jasmine Crockett's name trended for hours. Major outlets paused their regular programming to replay that singular moment when she dared to go further, when others believed the spotlight had dimmed. The political machine doesn't often make room for genuine clarity. It thrives on spectacle, confusion, and competing narratives. But what Crockett brought to that hearing was not only clarity, it was accountability carved in real time. And the effect was immediate. Overnight, people began revisiting not just her remarks but the entire trajectory of Trump's testimony. Analysts who had originally dismissed the hearing as symbolic now began dissecting timelines, documents, and the specific transactions Crockett referenced. Legal experts on primetime television acknowledged that what seemed like a formality was now a live wire of legal risk. The memo with Trump's signature, the transaction log linked to shell companies, the email trail involving senior staff. And yet, despite the rising scrutiny, the story was never just about the money. Jasmine Crockett's sharp dissection of financial misdeeds struck a nerve not because the figures were large, but because they were symbolic of a deeper betrayal. People had trusted a promise that politics would finally reflect their struggles. That someone who claimed to be an outsider would truly stand up for the average American. But the record Jasmine laid out suggested the opposite. Let's take a moment to examine the anatomy of what she presented. According to her documented references, millions of dollars funneled through campaign committees and third-party vendors had suspicious overlaps with entities owned by longtime Trump associates. These weren't isolated transactions. They formed a pattern. Campaign legal advisors had long operated in murky waters, exploiting legal loopholes, but what Jasmine underscored was the clear ethical rot behind those numbers. For the average viewer, these weren't just spreadsheets. They were signals. They meant fewer resources for outreach. They meant inflated invoices and donor funds reallocated to luxury travel. They meant people who believed in change being used to finance personal opulence. As Jasmine said in her follow-up interview later that evening, this is not just about money. It's about betrayal. It's about the systematic disrespect shown to working families who gave what they could to a campaign that promised revolution, but delivered enrichment for the few. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Let's look even closer at the context. This was a hearing meant to examine alleged misuse of campaign and PAC finances. The scope was already controversial. Several Republican leaders had tried to cast it as partisan spectacle. But Jasmine's methodical style, a style rooted in law and precedent, made it hard to write off her voice as political theater. Every line of questioning was tied to documentation. She cited names, dated memos, legal definitions, the kind of detail you don't present unless you're playing the long game. And that's what made her re-entry so powerful. Because she had waited, she had observed, she had let the noise die down. And then, when it mattered most, she returned to the microphone and delivered a narrative so grounded in evidence that it forced even the most skeptical minds to reconsider their positions. What's fascinating is how the emotional weight of the moment intersected with legal implications. You could see it on Trump's face. Not fear exactly, but unease. A kind of realization that he wasn't speaking to a chamber of predictable partisans, but someone whose commitment to truth outweighed her political ambition. And that shook him. The next day, Trump's legal team scrambled to issue statements. They claimed the documents were taken out of context. That the memos were drafts, not final. That any appearance of impropriety was simply a byproduct of campaign complexity. But by then, the narrative had moved beyond their reach. Crockett's moment had lit a fire. Investigative journalists dug deeper. Whistleblowers began reaching out to House committees. And multiple Democratic lawmakers cited her questioning as grounds to expand the scope of the inquiry. What few people realized was that Jasmine had been building toward that confrontation for weeks. Her team had been collecting data, coordinating with financial analysts, legal experts, and FOIA officers. Every word she delivered that day was the culmination of tireless behind-the-scenes effort, not just political performance but legal craftsmanship. Even her tone, the calm steadiness in her voice, was part of the strategy. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform rage. She spoke with the certainty of someone who knew the facts were on her side. And in doing so, she became the anchor in a storm of obfuscation. The long-term implications of that moment are still unfolding. Already, several new subpoenas have been issued. At least one former Trump campaign official is now cooperating with investigators. And quietly, even some GOP leaders have begun distancing themselves from the former president's legal exposure. None of them have cited Crockett by name, but her fingerprints are all over the shift. More importantly, though, something happened outside the Beltway. In neighborhoods across the country, from East Harlem to South Dallas, people saw someone who looked like them, sounded like them, and spoke for them, commanding the floor in one of the most powerful rooms in the world. And that matters. Representation is often reduced to optics in mainstream discourse. But what Jasmine Crockett reminded the country is that representation is also function. It's about who does the work, who prepares, who shows up not just for the photo op, but for the fight. And on that day, she showed up prepared to confront power with precision. As the news cycle began to slow days later, and as newer controversies emerged to compete for airtime, Crockett's moment remained unusually resilient. Think pieces poured in. University professors used her testimony as a case study in civic leadership. And younger activists cited her as a reminder that political courage is not about volume, it's about clarity. There's an instinct, especially in today's hyperpolarized political media, to seek out spectacle. To highlight the loudest, most outrageous moments. But what Crockett demonstrated is that sometimes the most devastating truths are delivered quietly. In the right hands, truth doesn't need fireworks. It just needs a microphone. And in that room, Jasmine Crockett did what few others dared. She didn't just speak, she testified. And her testimony didn't end with that day. It lives on now in new investigations, in renewed scrutiny of campaign finance laws, and in the cautious recalibration of those who once believed they could outmaneuver public accountability. Even now, long after the final gavel sounded, there's a buzz in Washington about what's next. Will more documents be released? Will Jasmine Crockett continue leading the charge? Will Trump's legal defenses hold under the pressure of documented inconsistencies? These are questions that have no easy answers. But what's certain is this: something shifted when she spoke again. The narrative cracked, the illusion broke, and the myth of invincibility surrounding Donald Trump began to fray, not with a bombshell, but with a binder, a calm voice, and the courage to speak when silence was expected. That is what history remembers. Not the grand exits, not the loudest shouts, but the unexpected moments when truth reclaims its seat at the table. So if anyone tells you that speaking up doesn't matter, show them this. Show them Jasmine. Show them what it looks like when one voice stands firm against power, and power, for once, doesn't have a comeback. This wasn't just another day in Washington. This was the day Trump thought it was over, and Jasmine Crockett spoke again. And the country listened.